Sienna Parker wiped the sweat from her brow, glaring at the stubbornly heavy box in front of her. It was her own fault for insisting on helping unload the shipment instead of waiting for the warehouse workers, but patience had never been her strong suit. She crouched, gripping the edges of the box, and tried to lift only for it to barely budge. A soft groan escaped her lips. "Need a hand." The deep, confident voice made her look up. Standing before her was a tall man with strong arms, wearing a fitted gray t-shirt and well-worn jeans. His dark hair was slightly tousled, and his piercing green eyes held a mix of amusement and concern. She straightened. "I've got it," she said, stubborn. "Sure you do," he chuckled, stepping forward. "But since I'm here, might as well help." Without waiting for permission, he bent down, lifted the box effortlessly, and placed it on the nearby dolly. Sienna crossed her arms. "Show off." "Just doing my good deed for the day," he said with a grin. "Name's Quentin Foster." "Sienna." "Nice to meet you, Sienna." He glanced at the remaining boxes. "You need help moving the rest," she hesitated. She wasn't used to accepting help. As CEO of Parker & Co., a high-end interior design firm, she was always the one in control. But today, in a dusty loading dock, she wasn't a CEO, just a woman struggling with heavy boxes. She exhaled. "Fine, if you insist." Quentin got to work without another word, his movements efficient and strong. She found herself watching him, how easily he handled the weight, the way his muscles flexed as he worked. He was attractive, no doubt, but there was something else about him, something steady and dependable. "So, what's in these boxes?" he asked, stacking another one. "Furniture samples." "My company designs luxury interiors." His brows raised. "Fancy," she shrugged. "It's a lot of work." "I hear that." He wiped his hands on his jeans before glancing at his watch. "I have to pick up my son soon, but I can help with a few more." Sienna blinked. "You have a son?" "Yeah, Oliver." "He's 6. A fond smile crossed his face. "Smart kid, keeps me on my toes." Something in her chest tightened. She hadn't expected that. "That's nice," she murmured. He arched a brow. "You sound surprised. Just didn't peg you as the dad type." Quentin laughed. "Fair enough." "But he's my world." Sienna didn't know what to say to that. She wasn't used to men who spoke about their kids with that much devotion. Most men she met were more interested in power and money, not bedtime stories and school pickups. Before she could respond, a voice called from the warehouse. "Miss Parker, we need you inside." She sighed, then turned back to Quentin. "Thanks for the help." "No problem." He gave her a nod. "See you around, Sienna." As he walked away, she found herself watching him go. She shook her head, pushing away the strange warmth in her chest. They were from different worlds. He was a single dad, probably working blue-collar jobs to provide for his kid. She was a CEO, running a multi-million-dollar company. Still, as she headed inside, she couldn't shake the feeling that Quentin Foster was someone she wouldn't forget anytime soon. Sienna adjusted the strap of her leather bag as she strode into her office, her heels clicking against the polished marble floor. The morning sun spilled through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting a warm glow over the sleek, modern space. She should have been focused on the string of meetings lined up for the day, but her mind kept drifting back to Quentin Foster. It had been a week since their encounter at the warehouse. A week since a man who wasn't a polished executive or a high-stakes investor had caught her attention in a way that unsettled her. She had built her entire career on keeping distractions at bay, yet here she was, distracted. "Miss Parker." Her assistant, Lillian, poked her head into the office. "Your 10 o'clock is here." Sienna straightened, pushing aside her thoughts. "Send them in." The door opened, and a tall, broad-shouldered man stepped inside. Sienna's breath hitched. "Quentin." He wore a crisp navy button-up and dark slacks, a far cry from the worn t-shirt and jeans she'd first seen him in. He looked effortlessly put together, but there was still that ruggedness to him and ease in the way he carried himself that made him seem entirely unfazed by the towering skyscraper surrounding him. "You." The words slipped past her lips before she could stop it. Quentin gave a low chuckle. "Didn't expect to see me, did you?" She folded her arms. "Not exactly." Lillian, oblivious to the tension in the room, handed Sienna a folder. "Mr. Foster is here to discuss the penthouse project for Sterling Enterprises." Sienna's fingers tightened around the folder. Sterling Enterprises was one of their biggest clients, a real estate empire known for its luxury developments. She had assumed their representative would be another polished executive in designer suits, not the man who had helped her move furniture samples like it was just another Tuesday. Lillian exited, leaving them alone. Sienna exhaled. "You work for Sterling." Quentin settled into the chair across from her desk. "Not exactly, I own it." She blinked. He leaned back slightly. "I take it you didn't Google me after our little warehouse encounter." She hadn't. But now she wished she had. "Sterling Enterprises is yours?" she asked, her voice measured. "Bought it 5 years ago." His expression was unreadable, but there was something knowing in his gaze. "You assumed I was just some guy lifting boxes." Sienna wasn't easily caught off guard, but this was unexpected. She kept her expression neutral. "You didn't correct me," he shrugged. "Didn't see a reason to." She studied him. Most men in his position flaunted their success, but Quentin had said nothing. No name-dropping, no power plays. Just a man who had helped her without expecting anything in return. Her pulse quickened. She cleared her throat. "So the penthouse project." He nodded, reaching for the folder. "Sterling wants something bold, something that makes a statement." Sienna flipped the pages, scanning the details. "Our designs always make a statement." "I've heard." His gaze lingered on her. "That's why I wanted you on this." Something about the way he said it sent a shiver through her, not just her company, her. She forced herself to focus. "We can discuss design concepts, but if you're looking for something truly unique, I'll need to visit the space myself." Quentin nodded. "I'll have a car pick you up tomorrow morning." "I can drive myself." "I know," he said smoothly, "but let me do this one thing." "Call it a favor." Her lips parted, but she found no argument, no reason to refuse. Tomorrow she would step into his world, and she wasn't entirely sure she was ready for it. Sienna stepped out of the sleek black town car, her gaze drifting upward at the towering structure before her. The Sterling Enterprises penthouse was perched at the very top of the gleaming skyscraper, a symbol of wealth and power. She had worked on luxury projects before, but this one felt different, a little more personal, though she wasn't sure why. The doorman greeted her with a polite nod before ushering her inside. A private elevator awaited, its doors sliding open with a quiet chime. As she stepped in, she found Quentin already inside, his tall frame leaning casually against the mirrored wall. "You're punctual," he noted, his voice carrying the faintest trace of amusement. "I run a business," she replied smoothly. "I don't have the luxury of being late." His gaze flickered with something unreadable. "Neither do I." The elevator ascended, the air between them thick with an awareness she wasn't ready to acknowledge. When the doors slid open, she was greeted by a space so breathtaking it briefly stole the words from her lips. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed a panoramic view of the city, a skyline that stretched endlessly beneath a sky streaked with morning light. The open-concept design was sleek, modern, yet somehow wore a delicate balance rarely achieved in places designed for power rather than comfort. Quentin gestured toward the vast living space. "This is what you'll be working with." She stepped forward, already envisioning possibilities. "You live here?" she asked, more out of curiosity than anything else. He shook his head. "No, this is an investment property. Sterling is planning to sell it once it's finished." Sienna nodded, running her fingers lightly along the marble island in the kitchen. "And you want the design to be bold." He stepped closer, standing just behind her. "I want it to be unforgettable." Something in the way he said it made her pulse quicken. She turned slightly, finding him watching her with an intensity that sent warmth curling through her stomach. "I can do that," she said, her voice steady despite the way her heart was racing. He studied her for a moment before nodding. "Good." She pulled out her tablet, forcing herself to focus. "I'll need measurements, material preferences, and any specific requests before I finalize a concept." "I trust your judgment," she arched a brow. "That's a lot of trust for someone you barely know." His lips curved slightly. "I know enough." A knock at the door interrupted them before she could respond. A moment later, a small boy with messy brown hair and bright blue eyes bounded inside, his face lighting up when he spotted Quentin. "Dad?" Sienna blinked, startled. She had known Quentin had a son, but she hadn't expected to meet him here. Quentin crouched, catching the boy effortlessly as he ran into his arms. "Hey, buddy, did you have fun with Mrs. Thompson?" Oliver nodded enthusiastically. We made cookies. I saved you one. He reached into his small backpack, pulling out a slightly squished but still recognizable chocolate chip cookie. Quentin accepted it with a warmth in his expression that Sienna hadn't seen before. Thanks, kid, you're the best. Oliver beamed before finally noticing her. His eyes widened slightly as he took in her stylish heels and tailored blazer. Who's she? Quentin set him down gently. This is Sienna. She's designing this place. Oliver looked up at her with open curiosity. Are you going to make it look cool? Sienna crouched slightly so they were at eye level. That depends. What do you think would make it cool? The boy's face lit up. A giant slide, she laughed, surprised by how easily he charmed her. That's an interesting idea. Quentin shook his head with a chuckle. I think we'll stick to something a little more practical, buddy. Oliver pouted but then grinned. Okay, but can it have secret doors? Sienna tapped a finger against her chin as if considering. I'll see what I can do. The boy's excitement was infectious, and for a brief moment, Sienna forgot about deadlines and contracts. She had spent so much of her life around ruthless businessmen and high-powered executives that this felt different, real. Quentin watched the exchange with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. When Oliver turned back to him, tugging at his sleeve, he stood. Think you can give us a minute, buddy? Quentin asked gently. Oliver nodded and trotted off to the other side of the penthouse, happily exploring. Once they were alone, Sienna straightened. He's a great kid. Quentin's gaze softened. Yeah, he is, she hesitated before asking his mother. Not in the picture, Quentin said simply. There was no bitterness in his tone, just quiet acceptance. Sienna nodded, sensing there was more to the story but knowing better than to pry. Does it bother you? He asked suddenly. She frowned. What? That I have a kid? She met his gaze, finding nothing but honesty there. No, she said truthfully. It doesn't. Something shifted between them then, something unspoken yet undeniable. Quentin was the kind of man she had never allowed herself to be drawn to grounded, steady, fiercely devoted to something beyond himself. And yet she was drawn to him all the same. She cleared her throat, breaking the moment. I should get started on the initial sketches. Quentin nodded, but there was something knowing in his eyes. Right, work first. She turned toward her tablet, ignoring the way her pulse betrayed her. This was just a project, nothing more. At least, that's what she told herself. Sienna stood in the penthouse's grand living area, surveying the completed design with a sense of quiet pride. The space was exactly as she had envisioned, bold, elegant, unforgettable. Every detail had been meticulously crafted, from the custom-made light fixtures that cast a warm glow across the room to the intricate woodwork that lined the walls, adding depth to the modern aesthetic. It was a masterpiece. And yet, as she traced her fingers along the edge of the marble countertop, her thoughts weren't on the project itself. They were on the man standing a few feet away, watching her with an expression she had come to recognize something between admiration and restraint. Quentin had been an enigma since the moment they met, a man who carried power with effortless ease but never flaunted it, a father who spoke of his son with unwavering devotion, a person who had proven time and time again that kindness wasn't a weakness, but a quiet strength. She turned to face him. Well, his gaze moved across the room before settling back on her. It's perfect. Relief flickered through her, though she wasn't sure why she cared so much about his approval. Good, I was worried you'd want something more dramatic. A slow smile curved his lips. You don't do anything halfway, Sienna. I knew whatever you created would be exactly what this place needed. Warmth spread through her chest, but she forced herself to stay professional. I'm glad you think so, she said, keeping her tone even. The final touches were finished this morning. The space is officially move-in ready. Quentin nodded, but he didn't look at the penthouse. He looked at her. So this is it then, she hesitated. What do you mean? He took a step closer, the air between them shifting. The project's done, no more site visits. No more excuses to see each other. Her breath caught. He wasn't wrong. Their work together had been the foundation of their interactions, the reason she had let herself be pulled into his orbit. Without it, there was nothing tying them together, unless she swallowed hard. I suppose not. Quentin studied her, his expression unreadable. Tell me something, Sienna. If I hadn't been standing in that warehouse that day, lifting those boxes, would you have ever looked at me twice? The question struck her like a bolt of lightning. It wasn't said with bitterness, only quiet curiosity, but it made her heart ache all the same. She could have lied, pretended that their worlds had always been destined to collide, but she refused to diminish what had grown between them by hiding behind falsehoods. No, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. I probably wouldn't have. Quentin nodded slowly as if he had expected her answer, but instead of stepping back, he moved even closer. And now, she exhaled shakily. Now I can't stop thinking about you. Something in his eyes darkened, and before she could say another word, he reached for her, his fingers brushing against her wrist. Then tell me why you're still holding back. Sienna's pulse pounded. Because I don't know how to do this, she confessed. I've spent my entire life building something out of nothing. I don't know how to let someone in, not like this. Quentin's grip tightened ever so slightly. You think I don't get that? His voice was low, steady. I've spent years making sure Oliver has everything he needs. I don't take risks when it comes to the people I let into our lives. But you, Sienna. He exhaled, shaking his head. You're not just some passing distraction. Her throat tightened. I don't want to hurt you, she admitted. You won't. His hand moved to her jaw, tilting her face toward his. But if you walk away now, you might hurt yourself. A war raged inside her. Logic told her to step back to protect herself from the unknown, but her heart was screaming at her to take the leap, and for once she listened. She closed the distance between them, pressing her lips to his in a kiss that was both hesitant and consuming. Quentin responded instantly, his arms wrapping around her as if he had been waiting for this moment all along. When they finally pulled apart, he rested his forehead against hers. So, he murmured, does this mean I get to see you outside of work? She let out a breathless laugh. I think that's a real possibility. His fingers traced slow circles against her back. Good, because I wasn't ready to let you go. Neither was she. For the first time in a long time, Sienna Parker wasn't thinking about the next project, the next deal, the next carefully calculated move. She was thinking about Quentin Foster, and she had a feeling she'd be thinking about him for a very long time. Quentin leaned against the balcony railing, the city lights stretching endlessly beneath them. The air was warm, carrying the distant hum of traffic, but the only thing Sienna was aware of was the man standing beside her. The weight of the evening clung to her skin, the completed project, the confession, the kiss. Everything had shifted. She turned slightly, studying his profile, the sharp angles of his face, the quiet confidence he carried so effortlessly. He had always been different from the men she was used to. There was no arrogance, no need to prove anything. He was simply himself, and that was enough. You look like you're thinking too much, Quentin said, his voice cutting through the silence. Sienna exhaled, a small smile tugging at her lips. That's what I do. He glanced at her, amusement flickering across his face. Want to tell me what's on your mind? She hesitated. Vulnerability wasn't something she navigated easily, but Quentin had a way of making difficult things seem simple. I've spent so much of my life planning every move, she admitted. Every step of my career, every decision strategic, calculated, but this, us, she gestured between them. I don't have a plan for this. His gaze softened and he reached for her hand, threading his fingers through hers. Maybe you don't need one. Her chest tightened. That's not how I operate. Quentin studied her for a moment before speaking. Sienna, you built your company from the ground up. You know how to take risks. This is different, she murmured. Why? Because if I make a mistake in business, I can fix it, she said. But if I let someone in and it falls apart? She trailed off, shaking her head. Quentin squeezed her hand gently. I get it. I've had to be careful about who I let into my life too, especially with Oliver. The mention of his son sent warmth through her. She had seen firsthand how devoted Quentin was as a father, how much Oliver meant to him. I don't want to be something temporary, she said honestly. His grip on her hand tightened. Neither do I. A breeze swept through the balcony, rustling the edges of her blouse. The weight of his words settled between them, solid and certain. After a moment, he turned toward the penthouse. Come on, there's something I want to show you. Curious, Sienna followed him inside. The living room was bathed in soft lighting, the result of her carefully curated design choices. Quentin led her toward a hallway she hadn't explored during the project, stopping at a door she hadn't paid much attention to. He pushed it open, revealing a smaller room with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lining the walls. A plush reading chair sat in the corner, next to a window overlooking the city. It was warm, inviting a space that felt personal. "I had this added after you started working on the penthouse," Quentin said. Sienna frowned slightly. "This wasn't in the original plans." "No," he admitted. "But after getting to know you, I realized something: you never stop. You're always working, always moving. So I thought if you ever needed a place to just breathe, this could be it." Her breath caught. "You designed this for me." His expression was unreadable, but his voice was steady. "Yeah." She stepped further into the room, running her fingers along the spines of the books on the shelves. Titles she recognized, some she had mentioned in passing during their conversations. He had been listening. Something inside her unraveled. "This is." She swallowed hard, searching for the right words. "No one's ever done something like this for me." Quentin stepped closer. "You deserve it." Her throat tightened. She had spent so many years proving herself, fighting for respect, for success. But Quentin didn't see her as a CEO or a businesswoman to be impressed by. He saw her, and that terrified her just as much as it made her want to stay. She turned to face him, her pulse hammering. "I don't know how to do this," she admitted again, her voice barely above a whisper. Quentin reached for her, his hands settling at her waist. "Then let's figure it out together." She exhaled shakily, nodding. For the first time in a long time, Sienna Parker didn't have all the answers, and maybe for once that was okay. Sienna stood by the floor-to-ceiling window of the penthouse, the city sprawling beneath her like a glittering expanse of endless possibilities. Quentin had left her in the newly designed reading nook after their conversation, giving her space to absorb it all. But instead of settling into the plush chair, she found herself drawn to the view, to the reflection of herself in the glass one that no longer looked entirely like the woman she had been before. She had spent so long keeping herself separate, untouchable, believing that love was a distraction, a liability. But Quentin had dismantled those walls without even trying. He had simply been there, steady and sure, showing her that not everything in life had to be calculated. A sound behind her made her turn. Quentin was back, rolling up the sleeves of his shirt as he leaned against the doorway. "I was starting to think you might sneak out," he said, not accusing, just quietly observant. She shook her head. "No, I just needed a moment." He nodded, watching her carefully. "Did you find the answer you were looking for?" Sienna exhaled. "I don't think there is an answer, not one that fits into the structured way I usually approach things." Quentin crossed the room, stopping just in front of her. "Maybe that's a good thing." She searched his face, finding no trace of hesitation in his expression. "You're not afraid of this?" "Afraid?" Quentin repeated, tilting his head slightly. "No, but I know it's real, and real things take work." "I don't know how to be someone who just lets things happen," she admitted. He reached for her hand, his grip warm and grounding. "Then don't. Be someone who chooses. Choose this, Sienna. Choose me." Her heart pounded, not with fear, but with something dangerously close to hope. "And if I do?" His fingers brushed against her cheek, his voice impossibly steady. "Then I'll make sure you never regret it." The realization settled over her like a quiet certainty. This wasn't something fleeting. This was something she could build, something just as strong as the empire she had spent years constructing. Maybe even stronger. She lifted her chin, searching his gaze. "Then I choose you." Quentin's lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile, something deeper, more resolute. And then he kissed her, not with urgency, but with the slow, deliberate certainty of a man who knew exactly what he wanted. When they finally pulled apart, he rested his forehead against hers. "Good, because I was always going to choose you too." Months passed, and what had once felt uncertain became something steady, something woven into the very fabric of Sienna's life. She no longer questioned Quentin's presence beside her. It had become second nature, as effortless as breathing. She found herself at his house more often than not, spending evenings with him and Oliver, learning how to exist in a space that wasn't dictated by boardroom meetings and business strategies. It was a different kind of world, one filled with laughter over messy dinners, bedtime stories, and early morning coffee shared in quiet companionship. And then one evening, Quentin took her hand as they stood in his backyard, the city skyline glowing in the distance. "I have something for you," he said, his voice steady but carrying an edge of something deeper. Sienna arched a brow. "If this is another secret reading nook, I don't know how you're going to top the last one." Quentin chuckled, then reached into his pocket. The moment she saw the small velvet box, her breath caught. He didn't drop to one knee not because the moment lacked significance, but because it didn't need theatrics. Instead, he held it out to her, his gaze unwavering. "I never expected you," he admitted. "But I can't imagine my life without you now. You've built so much on your own, but I want to build something with you. A life, a future." He flipped open the box, revealing a ring that sparkled in the soft evening light. "Marry me, Sienna." Her throat tightened, emotions crashing over her in a way she hadn't anticipated. She had spent her life making decisions based on logic, but this was the easiest choice she had ever made. "Yes," she whispered, barely able to get the word out before Quentin's arms were around her, pulling her into a kiss that felt like a promise. The wedding was intimate, held in a sun-drenched garden with only the people who mattered most. Oliver had been thrilled, insisting on wearing a tiny suit and walking his father down the aisle as the two most important people in his life promised forever to each other. And as Sienna stood with Quentin, their hands entwined, she realized that love wasn't a distraction or a risk. It was the best decision she had ever made, a future she had never dreamed of, but now couldn't imagine living without. And as Quentin kissed her under a canopy of twinkling lights, she knew with absolute certainty this was only the beginning.